War over Taiwan will be decided by this narrow strait. The strait decides everything because it turns big ambitions into a short, exposed transit problem that rewards preparation and punishes improvisation. At its narrowest, the Taiwan Strait is about 160 kilometers wide, which is close enough to feel crossable, but far enough that moving mass across it becomes a major operation while under observation. That exposure window is what gives the defender leverage, because time in transit is time that you can be tracked, targeted, delayed, or forced to reroute. That same exposure also makes the strait an economic pressure point, because commercial shipping reacts fast to risk, and risk concentrates in narrow, contested waters. The strait's geometry sets the basic rulebook because it sits at the reach of modern surveillance and long-range fires. The strait is narrow enough that both sides can watch it densely and contest it with layered systems from shore, sea, and air. That makes the crossing moment the most fragile moment, because you cannot skip transit and you cannot hide mass for long in a sensor-rich corridor. It also compresses decision time, because the forces are already in range, so crises can move from signaling to contact quickly once red lines feel threatened. In practical terms, geography forces planners to think in windows and thresholds, not just platform counts. Weather turns the strait from a map feature into a calendar, because seasonal winds in sea states change what large-scale movement looks like. Peer-reviewed research describes the strait as monsoon-dominated, with northeast monsoon winds in winter and southwest monsoon winds in summer. The winter northeast monsoon tends to be stronger than the summer winds, which can raise sea state and add friction for sustained amphibious movement and small craft operations. Bad weather does not magically make the strait safe for the defender or impossible for the attacker, but it narrows good enough windows to precise synchronized movement at scale. In a modern fight, weather also reshapes sensing and targeting, shifting which sensors work best and where the risks concentrate rather than simply reducing risk everywhere. Sea state matters because it controls throughput, and throughput is the heart of any cross-strait operation. Amphibious movement depends on steady lift cycles, which means disruption is often more decisive than destruction. Rough conditions, slow loading, slow transit, and slow offload, and every delay increases exposure to being tracked and struck. Mechanical failures, navigation errors, and congestion become more likely when you are forcing mass movement under stress. This is why the strait rewards strategies that build slack and redundancy, because tight schedules are vulnerable schedules. Taiwan's shoreline is where the strait's physics turn into a defensive advantage, because geography forces assault options into predictable zones. The east coast is dominated by rugged, rocky terrain that analysis often describes as poor landing terrain for large-scale amphibious assaults. The west coast contains more plausible landing and port objectives, but shallow coastal waters and dense development complicate approaches and make many options more predictable. Predictability is everything for defense because it allows concentrated mines, coastal missiles, artillery, drones, and obstacles and pre-planned fires in the places an attacker is most likely to choose. Even choosing ports does not remove the problem because ports sit inside dense urban terrain where taking the infrastructure you need can become the hardest part of the operation. Terrain behind the coast shapes what happens after landing, and it is where just get ashore plans often begin to fail. Large forces need space to stage, disperse supplies, and build combat power, but much of Taiwan's west is a mix of dense cities and constrained terrain that can choke movement and logistics. The interior is mountains, which funnels movement into a limited number of corridors and passes, making predictable routes for defense and interdiction. This means the assault problem is not one crossing, it's a sequence of choke points, each of which can slow tempo and raise costs. If the defender can trade space for time, the attacker's key risk becomes running out of time before consolidation, reinforcement, and political pressure shift the balance. In a sensor era, the strait is less about distance and more about visibility because movement is increasingly transparent. Any large crossing force has to assume it is being watched by satellites, aircraft, surface radars, and drones, plus passive sensing and pattern analysis. That changes the value of deception because deception must be sustained and multi-layered, not a single feint. It also elevates the importance of suppressing sensors and communications because early detection gives defenders more time to strike and more time to mobilize. equalize. The central contest becomes who can keep a picture and who can deny a picture. That visibility is why missiles, air defense, submarines, mines, and electronic warfare become decisive strait tools even before anyone talks about landing troops. If you can maintain targeting and strike quickly, you can impose costs on anything that tries to move across the narrow corridor. If you can deny targeting, you can move with less risk, but denial rarely needs to be perfect to cause major disruption. Mines are powerful in narrow waters because they can slow tempo, force reroutes, and create psychological barriers that deter commercial and military movement alike. Undersea threats complicate escort and transportation protection because the most valuable ships in a crossing are often the slow, fragile logistics vessels that cannot dodge easily. The strait also shapes coercion strategies because it gives Beijing options that exploit geography without immediately committing to an all-in landing campaign. When the risk rises, commercial traffic can change behavior even without a declared blockade, because insurers, shippers, and crews do not wait for a formal announcement. Blockade-style pressure can be built through exercises, exclusion zones, persistent presence, and inspection-like behavior that signals control in a confined area. The physical visibility of activity in the strait makes signaling effective because the world can see it and markets can react to what they see. This is why the strait is a rare place where military coercion and economic coercion overlap almost perfectly. The strait is also a global economic pressure point because of how much trade passes through or near it and how concentrated Taiwan's own port activity is. CSIS estimates Taiwan's ports handle about $586 billion in trade in 2022 and noted that much of this activity is concentrated on a handful of ports close to the mainland. CSIS analysis also estimated that roughly $2.45 trillion worth of goods, which is over 1/5 of global maritime trade, transits the Strait of Taiwan. Those numbers matter because even partial disruption pushes rerouting, delays, and higher insurance costs that spread across supply chains globally. In other words, the Strait is not only a battlefield, it's a switch that can transmit regional tension into a global economic shock. Because the Strait affects third parties fast, it changes deterrence dynamics by expanding who feels the cost of coercion. When the costs spread to Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, Europe, and the United States through shipping and supply chains, pressure builds on governments to respond. That can strengthen deterrence by raising the political price of coercion. But it can also raise escalation risk by creating more actors with stakes in red line. This is why the Strait has outsized strategic gravity, because it creates a multi-audience crisis where signaling must land with militaries, publics, markets, and allies all at the same time. A constrained battle space with many audiences is inherently harder to control. Even gray zone preparation reflects the Strait's physical logic, because moving mass requires lift and improvisation is limited. Reuters reporting has documented PLA-linked exercises involving civilian ferries and cargo vessels that suggest planning to expand lift capacity beyond dedicated amphibious ships. The physical point is simple. Crossing capacity, offload speed, and sustainment throughput are the differences between a concept and a viable operation. Anything that increases lift and reduces dependency on just a few ports and ramps changes the operational calculus, even if it does not guarantee success. This is why seemingly mundane maritime activity becomes strategically meaningful in this specific geography. The Strait also compresses response times for the United States and allies because distance is a strategic variable and this is a close-in fight. In any crisis, the initial balance depends heavily on what forces are already forward and how quickly they can move through contested air and sea space. Reinforcement is not only travel time, it is whether routes remain open and staging areas remain secure under missile and aerial threat. That makes readiness, posture, and early warning more consequential than in theaters where distance buys time. Geography therefore rewards denial strategies, because if you can make the Strait punishing to cross, you can shape escalation without needing immediate offensive dominance. The most underappreciated Strait dynamic is that it forces concentration, and predictable concentration is exactly what precision warfare punishes. Any large movement has to concentrate ships, escorts, aircraft, logistics, and timing into a corridor, because you cannot move an army over water casually. That concentration creates clusters that can be delayed, disrupted, and even if they cannot all be destroyed. Delaying a crossing can be as decisive as sinking ships, because time time is what the defenders trade for mobilization and coalition response. The Strait rewards friction because friction is what makes complex plans unravel. The Taiwan Strait decides everything because it turns cross-strait strategy into a contest of physics, tempo, and risk tolerance in front of the whole world. Its narrow geometry and surveillance exposure make transit the vulnerable moment and make timing a central variable. Monsoon-driven seasonal conditions narrow windows for precise, large-scale movement and add friction that favors defense and disruption. Taiwan's coastline and interior terrain constrain landing options and create choke points that push attackers toward predictable, costly paths. And the Strait's economic centrality means that even limited coercion can spread costs globally, shaping deterrence, escalation incentives, and crisis politics far beyond the immediate combatants. The physical layer is just one part of this analysis, but there's still many more to discuss, especially in the political layer. Taiwan's quest for independence has changed forever, and that could make war even more likely. Taiwan's 2024 election didn't just pick a president, it rewired how Taiwan makes China policy under pressure. The headline outcome was clear, but the real story is the new governing geometry in Taipei because the presidency and the legislature now pull in different directions. That split matters because Beijing treats elections as security events, and it looks for a seam that it can widen through coercion, timing, and narrative. If you want to understand what changes next, you have to track down how Taiwan's internal politics shapes deterrence signals, crisis decision speed, and how Washington calibrates support when Taipei is more constrained. Taiwan's 2024 election produced a rare combination: continuity at the top and friction in the system beneath it. The Democratic Progressive Party kept the presidency with Lai Ching-te winning the January 2024 election. At the same time, the legislature moved into a no-majority configuration, which changes how quickly policies can be passed and how unified Taiwan's messaging can stay. That mix is what changed everything, because Beijing and Washington both watch Taiwan's internal cohesion as a strategic variable. The first key fact is that Lai won without a majority, and that shapes Beijing's propaganda and Taiwan's domestic bargaining environment. Official reporting and international coverage shows Lai won with about 40% of the vote, with the opposition split between the KMT and the TPP. The plurality win is still a win, but it gives opponents room to argue about mandate, especially on sensitive issues like defense budgets, conscription policy, and cross-strait messaging. It also gives Beijing narrative material, because it can claim Taiwan is internally divided and therefore easier to pressure. The second key fact is the legislature, because Taiwan's cross-strait policy is not just about speeches, it's budgets, laws, oversight, and sustainment and implementation. Taiwan's Central Election Commission results showed the KMT emerged with 52 seats, the DPP with 51 seats, and the Taiwan People's Party with 8 seats in the 113-seat legislative yuan. That means no party holds the 57-seat majority threshold, creating a genuine hung parliament dynamic where coalition building and procedural fights becomes the normal. The consequence here is simple: big moves become harder and the politics of delay become more powerful. This is how governing reality changes deterrence in a very practical way, because deterrence depends on speed and clarity. Taiwan has to show it can respond quickly in a crisis, pass budgets that match the threat assessment, and maintain constant signaling to both its public and foreign partners. Divided government increases the risk of mixed messaging, not just because Taiwan lacks the will, but because the legislative bargaining creates multiple public narratives all at once. Beijing can exploit that by timing pressure around Taiwan's internal disputes, making every domestic political fight feel like a strategic choice. It also changes how domestic politics treats defense policy, because opposition parties can frame their resistance as oversight rather than weakness. Even when parties agree Taiwan faces pressure, they can disagree sharply on how to spend, what to prioritize, and what level of risk is acceptable in signaling to Beijing. That creates a background over procurement, reserve reform, civil defense, and budget trade-offs, where the argument is not defense or not, but this defense plan or that one. For Beijing, that is useful, because it can push narratives that portray Taiwan's defense choices as controversial, reckless, or unnecessary, depending on the audience. So what actually changed in Taipei is not only about party control. It is the mechanics of governing under pressure. The pressure sets priorities and tone, but major policy needs legislative coordination, and coordination is now more conditional and transactional. The TPP becomes a potential pivot actor in some votes, which means China-related policy can become a bargaining chip in broader domestic negotiations. In a crisis, that can slow decision-making, and slow decision-making is exactly what coercion strategies aim to induce. Beijing's read on the result matters because China does not treat Taiwan's elections as normal democratic events. It treats them as a threat signal. Taiwan's government has repeatedly described Beijing's approach as pushing the One China principle framework and framing democratic outcomes it dislikes as separatist moves. Reporting since the election and into the current period shows Beijing has refused to engage with Lai, labeling him as a separatist, which signals a continued hard line on political contact. That stance shapes Beijing's coercion menu because if it won't engage politically, it leans harder on military presence, economic pressure, and political warfare as substitutes. Beijing's response style is often about calibrating pressure rather than flipping a switch, because the goal is to shape Taiwan's choices over time. Beijing can raise or lower the tempo of military activity to create constant background and stress that influences domestic debate and investor confidence. It can also pair that tempo with messaging that blames Taiwan's ruling party for instability, aiming to turn security anxiety into political friction. That is why elections matter so much. They determine which domestic narratives are easiest for Beijing to amplify. The US-Taiwan-China triangle after 2024 becomes more complex because Washington has to support Taiwan while also reading Taiwan's internal constraints accurately. The US quickly signaled continuity by congratulating Lai and praising Taiwan's democratic process in an official statement. Those signals matter for deterrence because Washington also pays attention to whether Taiwan can pass budgets and reforms that sustain readiness over time. When Taiwan's domestic politics are more contested, the US has to manage two audiences at once: Taiwan's leadership and legislature, and its own domestic political system that must support long-term commitments. Divided politics in Taipei can raise misperception risk, because adversaries probe for weaknesses and allies probe for reality. Beijing may misinterpret legislative resistance or messaging disputes as lowered resolve, even when Taiwan's public support for security remains strong. Washington may interpret slow reforms as capacity limits rather than as political friction, which can affect how it prioritizes assistance and signaling. Taiwan can end up stuck between a China that pressures harder and partners who demand faster results, which is a classic coercion trap. This is also why Taiwan's internal messaging discipline becomes a strategic asset after 2024. In a high-pressure environment, every domestic debate can be reframed externally, and every external incident can be weaponized domestically. The more Taiwan's parties contradict each other publicly on core red lines and offensive priorities, the more room Beijing has to portray Taiwan as unstable or divided. The stronger Taiwan is at maintaining shared baseline messages while debating specifics, the harder it is for Beijing to split audiences. A useful way to see the post-2024 environment is that Taiwan's political system now has to do two hard things simultaneously. It has to preserve democratic competition because that is the source of legitimacy and social cohesion. It also has to behave like a crisis management system, because China's pressure campaign never fully pauses. That situation is not a flaw, it is a core feature of Taiwan's strategic challenge. So what should you watch next if you're wanting to know whether the 2024 election strengthened deterrence or created exploitable seams? Watch whether the legislature produces gridlock or workable bargaining on national security budgets and readiness reforms, because budgets are policy made real. Watch whether Taiwan's major parties converge on a shared baseline about sovereignty, coercion red lines, and crisis communication, because that reduces Beijing's ability to play domestic politics as a lever. Watch Beijing's coercion tempo, not only its rhetoric, because tempo is how China signals pressure while testing responses. And watch Washington's signaling and arms timelines around Taiwan, alongside Taiwan's internal debates, because misalignment between commitments and domestic politics is where deterrence credibility can wobble. One more indicator matters more than it seems: whether domestic political competition starts rewarding clarity or rewarding ambiguity. If parties compete over who looks toughest while offering unclear policy, crisis management gets riskier. If parties compete over who can deliver practical resilience, like readiness reforms, civil defense capacity, and economic continuity planning, deterrence gets stronger. Beijing prefers Taiwan politics that produce paralysis, because paralysis looks like inevitability, and inevitability is the narrative foundation of coercion. Taiwan's 2024 election changed everything with China because it changed how Taiwan governs under pressure, not because it changed Taiwan's identity overnight. The presidency provided continuity, but the legislature created a new era of bargaining and constraint, and that will shape the speed and clarity of Taiwan's China policy. Beijing themselves will keep treating Taiwan's democratic choices as security events, and it will keep using coercion tools designed to exploit any political seam it can find. Washington will keep signaling support, but it will also watch whether Taiwan's system can translate that support into sustained readiness and credible crisis management. If you want to predict what comes next, track the mechanic of governance, because after 2024, Taiwan's China strategy is inseparable from how Taiwan's democracy functions day to day. If China is going to invade Taiwan by 2027, there are a couple of ways they'll likely go about it. How China would actually attack Taiwan comes down to one choice Beijing cannot avoid: blockade-style pressure first, or the risk of an invasion that could fail fast and publicly. Once coercion starts, the question becomes what Beijing can sustain, what Taiwan can endure, and what outside actors are willing to contest in real time. The most plausible opening move is designed to look legally arguable, operationally ambiguous, and politically hard to counter. A quarantine, inspections, exclusion zones, and law enforcement operations can create economic shock and political leverage without immediately triggering the same level of military response as an invasion. If that pressure fails, Beijing can still climb the ladder toward limited strikes or a full landing attempt. China's most realistic path begins on the blockade spectrum, because Taiwan is an island economy and dependency is a weapon. Taiwan is exceptionally trade dependent, and CSIS estimates Taiwan's imports and exports in 2022 were roughly 61% and 69% of GDP respectively, which makes disruption strategically powerful even without major combat. The blockade spectrum is flexible because Beijing can calibrate pressure and scale it up or down depending on how the world reacts. The logic is to make normal life feel contingent on compliance, so markets and politics begin pushing Taiwan towards concession. The lowest rung option is the quarantine, which matters because it can be framed as law enforcement rather than war. CSIS defines a quarantine as a law enforcement-led operation to control traffic in a specific area, distinct from a military-led blockade meant to significantly curtail traffic. The advantage is ambiguity, because confronting Coast Guard and maritime safety forces can look escalatory even when the economic effect is severe. The advantage is also scalability, because Beijing can target certain goods, routes, or companies instead of shutting down everything at once. A quarantine also tests compliance and builds predicaments that make later escalation easier. CSIS argues a key goal is compelling countries and companies to comply with China's terms, strengthening Beijing's control narrative while undermining Taiwan's sovereignty. If most shippers comply, Beijing can normalize persistent presence and claim this is simply the new operating environment around Taiwan. From there, China can intensify with exclusion zones, inspection regimes, and persistent denial that makes shipping and aviation unreliable. The goal is not always a perfect seal, because uncertainty and delay can be enough to trigger economic pain and political stress. Custom-style inspections matter because boarding and delaying ships introduces time costs and legal risk that commercial actors tend to avoid. Compliance can also be enforced indirectly through fines, sanctions, and market access pressure that turns multinational firms into reluctant enforcement nodes. If Beijing moves from coercion to isolation, the military blockade model is more direct, more dangerous, and more potentially decisive. A military blockade is sustained denial backed by naval patrols, air power, missile threats, and the credible risk of a kinetic action against those who attempt to break it. It becomes a contest of endurance and escalation decisions over time, not just a single dramatic battle. Blockade-style pressure also pairs naturally with cyber and information operations that amplify confusion inside of Taiwan. The US Department of Defense describes scenarios where the PRC could use network attacks and limited kinetic strikes against political, military, and economic infrastructure to undermine confidence and induce fear. The goal is paralysis, make Taiwan feel isolated, make markets panic, and make leaders doubt whether resistance is sustainable. Now compare that to invasion, because amphibious invasion is not one operation, it's a chain of operations that all have to succeed in sequence. The Pentagon describes a joint island landing campaign as a complex, interlocking effort requiring electronic warfare, logistics, air, and naval support coordinated at scale. The objectives include breaking through shore defenses, establishing a beachhead, building combat power on Taiwan's western coastline, and seizing key targets. That same report calls large-scale amphibious invasion among the most difficult operations, requiring air and maritime superiority plus rapid sustainment under fire. Lift capacity is the first hard constraint, because you can't invade an island without moving a large force and then keeping it supplied. Reuters cites Taiwanese and American experts estimating PLA amphibious ships and landing craft can carry roughly 20,000 troops and equipment in a first wave. Reuters also notes estimates that subduing Taiwan could require far larger troop numbers overall, highlighting the follow-on and sustainment bottleneck. That gap is why China has explored using civilian roll-on, roll-off ferries or roll-roll ferries and cargo vessels as a shadow navy to expand its lift. Civilian shipping changes the shape of the invasion without making it easy, because every extra ship becomes a new vulnerability. Reuters documented PLA exercises involving civilian vessels unloading vehicles directly onto beaches and experimenting with temporary pier-like systems. More lift enables dispersion, but dispersion also increases escort and protection demands across a wider sea space. In an environment with mines, submarines, coastal missiles, and dense surveillance, protecting a massive transport armada is a full-time war all by itself. Beach and port constraints make invasion harder because Taiwan doesn't offer unlimited good landing zones for heavy forces. Taiwan's west coast contains the most plausible landing areas, concentrating risk into zones defenders can pre-plan to destroy or delay. Ports boost throughput, but they're fixed, surveilled, and often embedded in dense urban terrain that is difficult to seize quickly. If a landing stalls, the attacker faces a clock problem. Losses begin to rise, supplies lag, and the international reaction time expands. That is why the opening week kill chain is central, because Beijing would try to win favorable conditions before outside responses solidify. The Pentagon describes joint firepower strikes tied in PLA writings to Taiwan scenarios, including precision strikes against air bases, radars, and key nodes. The logic is to bind and suppress defenders, then present Taiwan with a compressed set of options under extreme time pressure. Beijing would likely combine kinetic pressure with electronic warfare and cyber disruption to slow Taiwan's response and complicate outside intervention. So what decides whether Beijing chooses blockade-style pressure, limited strikes, or invasion? One signal is mobilization behavior that moves beyond routine exercises into sustained logistics activation and readiness. Another is shipping control, including preparation to commandeer civilian ferries and cargo ships, which Reuters reporting suggests China has been exercising. Port activity and maritime pattern shifts matter because large amphibious operations create signatures that are difficult to fake at scale. The last signal is political, because Beijing will try to shape perceptions before it commits to an irreversible step. Quarantine-style operations test how countries, companies, and publics respond under pressure. If compliance is high and resistance is fragmented, Beijing learns it can extract gains without paying the cost of a full war. If resistance is unified and costly, Beijing can pause, reset, or escalate, which is much harder after troops start landing. In the real world, blockade versus invasion is less about which plan exists and more about which plan matches Beijing's risk appetite at the moment. Blockade-style pressure leverages ambiguity and economic shock while keeping escalation more controllable and reversible. Invasion is the high-variance option because it demands rapid, visible success and sustained logistics across a narrow strait under fire. That's why the most realistic pathway is an escalatory ladder that starts with isolation and paralysis, then climbs towards strikes or landings only if coercion fails. The military domain is indeed very complicated when it comes to Taiwan, but the economic domain is also very complicated and critical to Taiwanese survival. Taiwan's economy runs on one company, and that company sits at the center of the most important strategic pressure campaign in Asia. TSMC isn't just one successful firm. It's the anchor of Taiwan's export model and the critical node in global supply chains for advanced chips. That concentration creates protection because so many countries have a stake in Taiwan staying stable, but it also creates one obvious point of disruption. The real question is what happens when geopolitics hits a business that depends on uninterrupted power, water, shipping, and predictable global demand, and what Beijing can exploit without firing a single shot. Taiwan's semiconductor industry is so large it behaves like a national system, not a normal sector. The U.S. International Trade Administration assessed Taiwan's semiconductor industry generated over $165 billion in 2024. Around 20.7% of Taiwan's total GDP, and that Taiwan accounts for over 60% of global foundry revenue and over 90% of leading-edge manufacturing. When one ecosystem approaches a fifth of GDP, resilience stops being abstract and becomes a question of continuity. Can the system keep running through shocks? This is why Taiwan's economic story and security story are fused, because the same thing that drives growth also shapes deterrence and coercion risk. TSMC is the core because it turns Taiwan's talent and suppliers into manufacturing capability that's hard to replicate fast anywhere else. TSMC's edge is not just fabs and tools. It's an integrated island-wide ecosystem of engineers, precision servicing, materials, specialty chemicals, and process know-how. Taiwan's own leaders argue that large-scale relocation is unrealistic because the ecosystem is rooted on the island, meaning moving pieces without the whole doesn't reproduce the same performance. That ecosystem logic is what makes Taiwan economically invaluable and strategically exposed all at the same time. The fastest way to understand TSMC's strategic role is that it dominates the most advanced part of global chip stack. TSMC reports that advanced technologies defined as 7 nanometer and beyond accounted for 69% of total wafer revenue in 2024. That's the capacity powering high-end smartphones, leading AI accelerators, and the compute backbone of the entire global economy. When this cycle surges, Taiwan surges with it, and Reuters reported Taiwan's January 2026 exports jumped 69.9% year on year, with electronic components hitting levels tied to AI and cloud demand in major firms like TSMC. This is why we're focusing on TSMC in this video, because Taiwan's exposure is unusually concentrated to this company. Most countries can absorb a hit to one flagship firm by leaning on other pillars. But Taiwan's position in leading-edge chips is so dominant that disruption becomes macroeconomic very quickly. And because Taiwan produces more than 90% of leading-edge chips, a shock would propagate into the most sensitive parts of the global manufacturing immediately. In plain terms, Taiwan's prosperity and leverage rise together, and so does the size of the target painted on the same system. The silicon shield concept is real because disruption in Taiwan imposes costs on countries that would otherwise prefer to stay neutral. If supply is disrupted, prices rise, production schedules slip, and downstream pain hits everything from consumer electronics to defense-related systems. That widens the set of actors who resist instability because it stops being only a Taiwan problem and becomes a global production problem. But shields have limits because deterrence depends on credible willingness to absorb pain, and some players will hedge if they think that the cost of confrontation is higher than the cost of disruption. The silicon shield also has a darker side because dependence makes non-kinetic disruption more attractive. You don't need to occupy Taiwan to disrupt output, because chip making depends on stable electricity, large volumes of high-quality water, complex logistics, and specialized inputs that can all be slowed down or choked. If production pauses, the economic shock is real, even if conflict remains below the threshold of a full-scale war. That's why TSMC is a vulnerability in gray zone scenarios, not just in invasion scenarios. Energy is the first hard constraint, because advanced fabs are electricity-hungry machines that cannot tolerate instability. Analysts have highlighted how quickly semiconductor demand pressures Taiwan's power planning, because leading energy fabs run 24/7 with very tight tolerances. When one industrial ecosystem becomes large enough to influence national grid priorities, power policy becomes national security policy by default. Taiwan's push to diversify LNG imports, including Reuters reporting that Taiwan aimed for US LNG to account for roughly 30 to 33% of its imports in 2026, fits the logic of reducing vulnerability under strategic stress. Water is the second constraint because chip manufacturing depends on huge quantities of ultra-pure water and reliable water governance. Research on Taiwan's water governance and semiconductor production cited cited TSMC water withdrawal on the order of 104 million cubic meters in 2022 and described high recycling rates as part of resilience planning. TSMC's own sustainability reporting emphasizes water savings and recycled water volume, which is a signal that water security is not a side issue, it's core to its operations. Taiwan's drought experience already showed how environmental stress can collide with global chip supply, which is why water policy has become industrial policy. This is where the one company story becomes a national vulnerability story, because TSMC's dependencies map onto Taiwan's most fragile systems. Electricity requires generation, transmission stability, fuel security, and physical protection under stress. Water requires storage, treatment capacity, drought management, and politically hard decisions about allocation during shortages. And logistics require predictable shipping and insurance conditions, and those are the first things to wobble during coercion campaigns and regional tension spikes. This is why Beijing's most realistic leverage often looks economic and logistical before it looks kinetic. Taiwan is an island economy plugged into global trade, and anything that raises uncertainty in shipping, insurance, financing, or inputs can chill output and investment fast. Taiwan's own trade data shows vulnerability has been improving as export dependence on mainland China and Hong Kong declines from a 2020 peak. Taiwan's own Ministry of Finance reported exports to mainland China and Hong Kong were 31.7% in 2024, down 12.2 percentage points from the historical peak, which reduces leverage but also does not erase it. Economic coercion is already part of the cross-strait relationship, and the point is usually political friction, not maximum economic damage. China's coercion toolkit has included bans and restrictions on politically sensitive Taiwanese products, illustrating how targeted pressure can punish constituencies without triggering blowback of a full rupture. Narrow measures generate headlines and domestic political arguments, which is often the real objective. The signal is that pressure can be dialed up at politically convenient moments, which creates uncertainty that affects investment even when the trade volumes look normal. At the same time, Taiwan's export story is evolving in a way that ties performance even more tightly to the global AI cycle. Reuters reported record exports of economic components in January 2026 and a sharp jump in exports to the US, reflecting strong AI and cloud demand. That diversification is strategically helpful, but it also means Taiwan's macro performance becomes even more sensitive to global tech demand cycles and policy shocks like export control. In other words, Taiwan is shifting dependence from one set of geopolitical risks to another. Less reliance on China as a market, more reliance on the advanced tech cycle and politics around it. This is why every major power is now trying to reduce single point of failure exposure without breaking the ecosystem that works. TSMC is expanding overseas, including major investments in Arizona, while keeping the most critical capacity anchored in Taiwan, because that's where the ecosystem produces leading-edge output most reliably. Reuters reported Taiwan's vice premier rejected the idea that 40% of semiconductor capacity could be moved to the US, arguing it's impossible because the ecosystem is deeply rooted in Taiwan. This is the risk management era of chips. Governments want redundancy, firms want efficiency, and Taiwan wants to stay indispensable without becoming a hostage to other countries' security demand. The strategic takeaway is that TSMC's value doesn't automatically translate to safety, because coercion does not require occupation. A quarantine-style disruption, gray zone pressure on shipping, cyber disruption, or sustained uncertainty can reduce throughput and confidence even if fabs remain physically intact. Chipmaking's dependence on electricity and water means infrastructure stress can become an economic event, and economic events become political events very quickly. That's why Taiwan's resilience planning increasingly looks like national security planning, spanning energy imports, water governance, physical protection, and continuity of operations. What matters is whether Taiwan can keep the silicon shield strong while shrinking the number of easy levers that can be pulled against it. Watch how much leading edge capacity remains concentrated on the island versus distributed abroad, because concentration raises stakes and fragility all at the same time. Watch supply chain policy and export control dynamics, because restrictions can reshape where advanced packaging and leading edge production sit and who can buy what. Watch shipping risk signals like insurance spikes and rerouting behavior during cross-strait tension, because markets often react before governments. And finally, watch Taiwan's energy and water resilience moves, because the more stable these inputs become under stress, the less leverage any coercive campaign has against the core of the economy. Taiwan's economy runs on one company, and the strategic story is that this one company ties prosperity, deterrence, and vulnerability to the same geography. ITA's assessment that semiconductors represent a major share of GDP and that Taiwan dominates leading-edge manufacturing explains why the world treats Taiwan as economically indispensable. TSMC's advanced node revenue concentration explains why disruption would hit the most valuable segment of the global tech stack first. Taiwan's shifting export dependence also shows resilience is improving, but the core exposure remains. If the chip ecosystem stumbles, Taiwan feels it immediately, and the world feels it soon after. Taiwan's economy is certainly very important and complex, especially when relating to China, but the social domain is also incredibly important. Taiwan's attitude toward China is changing, and the fastest shift is happening among the voters who will dominate the island's politics for the next 2 decades. This isn't just about identity. It's a generation that grew up with democracy as the default and Chinese coercion as a background noise. The gap is widening because what young Taiwanese think China is willing to do has changed, and what they think Taiwan would lose feels concrete now. Taiwan's youth matter because they set the ceiling for what compromise can look like in the long run. Younger cohorts have only known a fully democratic Taiwan with open media, competitive elections, and a civic identity that feels normal, not aspirational. That baseline changes how persuasion works, because political integration doesn't read like policy, it reads like regime change. When Beijing frames Taiwan's democracy as something to be corrected, it collides with a cohort that treats democracy as part of who they are, not a negotiable preference. One clear signal is identity, because Taiwan's identity trendline has moved steadily toward Taiwanese, and the youngest are the sharpest version of that shift. Pew reported in early 2024 that adults in Taiwan under 35 were especially likely to identify as solely Taiwanese, at 83% in their survey. Taiwan's Election Study Center at the National Chengchi University shows a long-term movement in the same direction, with Taiwanese-only identification raising over the decades. The practical implication is that more voters experience cross-strait relations less as intra-national politics and more as external pressure from another state entirely. Generational memory explains why this hardens over time, because political instincts form around what people personally watched happen. Older cohorts retain more lived connection to earlier eras where Chinese identity and cross-strait ties meant something different in Taiwan's domestic politics. Younger cohorts' formative China memories are more likely to be about disinformation, diplomatic isolation, military pressure, and coercion rather than cultural kinship. That doesn't erase culture, it changes what culture feels like when it comes with an implied threat. Democratization and civic education also push the same direction, because they teach belonging through institutions rather than ethnicity. Elections, open debate, and social movements reward Taiwan-centered narratives because the arena itself is Taiwan's democracy. When young people mobilize politically, it's often framed as democratic agency and accountability, not ethnic reunification. The Sunflower Movement is widely discussed as a youth-led turning point that strengthened skepticism towards political integration with China and pushed identity politics towards civic sovereignty. Then Beijing accelerated the China at risk shift by making the cost of losing autonomy look vivid instead of theoretical. Hong Kong became the reference point because it offered a real-time demonstration of freedom's narrowing after political absorption. AP reported around the 2024 Taiwan election described Hong Kong migrants supporting Taiwan's ruling party in part because they watched civil liberties erode after the 2019 protests and the 2020 national security law. Even without personal ties to Hong Kong, the lesson is easy to internalize. Political promises can change after control is established. Military pressure reinforces that lesson because it makes the threat routine and personal. Frequent PLA aircraft and naval activity turns China from a cultural concept into a living security environment. The signal is a constant tempo, not episodic crisis, and constant tempo shapes identity by teaching vigilance. The more the pressure becomes normal, the harder it is to sell the idea that Beijing's intentions are benign. Public opinion suggests a common mindset exists in Taiwan. So that is a serious threat, but an unclear timeline, which is exactly the environment where coercion, short of war, becomes powerful. Reuters reported in October 2024, On an INDSR poll where 61% believed an invasion was unlikely in the coming 5 years, while majorities still expressed willingness to resist if attacked. That combination produces a politics of sustained pressure, where society is forced to live in the threat without knowing when it peaks. For young voters, that tends to harden identity while increasing sensitivity to disruption costs, because life planning happens under a permanent cloud. Economics shapes youth politics differently, not by making young people pro-China, but by changing what they feel they're defending and what they feel they're being denied. Housing affordability and wage anxiety squeeze younger adults, and the squeezed cohort is less likely to see cross-strait economic interdependence as personally rewarding. When older elites talk about China opportunities, many younger workers measure it against their lived reality of affordability, job quality, and future security. That creates a paradox. Youth can be more skeptical of China and still angry at domestic governance for failing to deliver a stable future. Housing matters politically because it shapes whether the system feels worth enduring pressure for. If young people believe the future is blocked at home, they become more cynical about institutions, and cynicism is a weakness in any democracy under coercion. If young people believe the system is improving, they interpret pressure as shared challenge that can be managed. That future confidence variable quietly affects deterrence because resilience is partly psychological. The information environment is where youth attitudes can be probed constantly, because youth politics is formed on platforms where identity and entertainment blend together. Platform algorithms shape what feels normal, what feels extreme, and what feels embarrassing to believe. Influence is less about convincing someone of one claim and more about tilting the emotional atmosphere, distrust, cynicism, and outrage, as well as resignation. The target is trust. Trust in elections, trust in institutions, trust in allies, and trust that democracy can handle the pressure. TikTok gets attention in Taiwan because it is popular with youth and sits inside wider concerns about algorithmic influence. Doublethink Lab published a 2025 nationwide online survey comparing TikTok users to non-users in Taiwan cross-strait and political attitudes. Reporting on the research highlighted correlations between frequent TikTok use and greater openness to certain pro-China narratives or skepticism toward Taiwanese democracy, while also noting nuance and limits to casual claims. The takeaway is not that one app brainwashes the youth and that platform incentives can shift what feels socially acceptable to doubt or repeat. Influence operations aim at fragmentation because a fragmented society is easier to pressure than a united one. If youth were nudged into cynicism, they disengage, and disengagement erodes democratic resilience over time. If youth were nudged toward avoid-provoking China narratives, deterrence weakens without anyone needing to endorse unification openly. If youth are nudged into believing their democracy is fake or dysfunctional, coercion works by lowering confidence, not by winning hearts. Taiwan's openness also creates a counter advantage because civil society can expose manipulation quickly once awareness rises. Taiwan has built a reputation for public attribution and rapid discussion of disinformation and cognitive warfare, which helps inoculate parts of the population. Digitally fluent youth can be more exposed and more capable all at the same time, which turns influence into a moving contest. The system is never fully safe, but it can become harder to exploit when society expects the attack. So what does this generational shift mean for the next decade of cross-strait politics? Pro-unification messaging faces a shrinking social base because identity trends and threats perceptions among younger cohorts move the other direction. Taiwan's parties will compete inside a narrower strategic corridor where how to deter is more valuable than whether to resist, even if methods begin to differ. Beijing will keep leaning into political warfare and coercion short of war because these tools target the same seams inside the democracy under stress. The key misunderstanding is thinking youth attitudes come from one factor instead of a stacked set of pressures that reinforce each other. Identity gives direction because it defines what young people in Taiwan believe. Threat perception provides urgency because it shapes what young people believe China might do. Economic stress shapes mood and cohesion because it determines whether democracy feels like it delivers a future worth defending. And platform dynamics shape incentives because they influence what feels safe to say, what feels cool to believe, and what feels socially risky to share. If the simplest indicators matter the most, 3 are enough. Identity trend lines among younger cohorts, because they define the political ceiling for accommodation. Youth future confidence signals, especially with housing and wages, because cohesion determines how long pressure can be absorbed, as well as the risk in the information environment, especially platform influence debates and attribution patterns, because the information layer is actually where pressure can be applied constantly without crossing into war. Speaking of the information layer, check out that analysis in this video. China is constantly trying to control the direction of Taiwanese politics, and elections are the most important target. Influence is less about one dramatic hack and more about shaping what feels risky, what feels inevitable, and what feels too costly to resist. Beijing wins when Taiwan's politics get noisier, trust gets thinner, and voters start doubting whether their choices can change anything at all. The giveaway is the pre-election ramp-up. Coordinated narratives, sudden scandal drops, and cross-platform amplification that looks organic until you begin to zoom out. Taiwan's elections are a frontline because Beijing's core objective is political control, and elections decide Taiwan's legitimacy and strategic direction. Beijing treats democratic outcomes on Taiwan as a sovereignty threat, so election seasons become moments to reshape risk perceptions and political incentives. The target is belief, not ballots, because belief shapes how Taiwan responds to coercion after the vote is over. That's why election interference is about the environment around voting: turnout, polarization, trust, and the sense of what outcomes are safe. A clean way to understand the strategy is that Beijing tries to manufacture 3 feelings at once: fear, cynicism, and inevitability. Fear links certain political choices to instability, war risk, or economic punishment, turning national security into domestic wedge issues. Cynicism pushes the idea that all politicians are corrupt and democracy is dysfunctional, which weakens social cohesion and lowers willingness to endure pressure. Inevitability suggests accommodation is the only realistic future, so resistance looks like pointless suffering rather than national agency. The toolkit ranges from subtle narrative steering to aggressive deception, and Taiwan sees the full spectrum. Researchers tracking manipulation around the 2024 election describe disinformation, conspiracy narratives, and coordinated amplification behaviors across multiple platforms. Flooding the zone with competing truths matters because confusion reduces the ability to mobilize consensus when crisis hits. The most effective campaigns don't need a majority because shifting margins or paralyzing decision-making can be enough. Disinformation spreads fastest when it rides on real social tension instead of inventing everything from scratch. Narratives that exploit polarization, identity anxiety, and economic frustration travel because they feel emotionally plausible and deeply personal. Rumor cascades matter because Taiwan's media ecosystem is fast and deeply online, so small claims can scale before verification catches up. That forces defensive messaging because the target spends time disproving instead of agenda setting, which is already a win for the attacker. Generative AI and deepfakes are part of the story as well, but the bigger story is speed, volume, and distribution. A Taiwan-focused generative AI report on the 2024 election found overall impact on public opinion appeared limited while documenting specific incidents and tactics used to speed and spread narratives. That matters because the win condition isn't a perfect fake. It's a constant stream of plausible content that keeps audiences reactive. Generative AI becomes a multiplier when it helps localize messages and keeps them circulating across many accounts all at once. Coordinated inauthentic behavior is the connective tissue, because repetition makes fringe narratives feel mainstream. Meta's threat reporting describes how networks use fake accounts and deceptive behaviors to manipulate discourse at scale. The tactical aim is perceived consensus, because people take cues from what they think everyone is saying. Once a narrative feels ubiquitous, mainstream outlets and politicians can get dragged into responding, amplifying the message further. Beijing also pushes messages through proxies because plausibility rises when the content doesn't look state-authored. Merrick's described PRC influence efforts as multi-pronged and more sophisticated than simple fake news, with content seeded through multiple channels. Proxy amplification preserves deniability, which complicates response and makes countermeasures easier to paint as partisan censorship. Economic signaling is also part of the influence campaign because coercion communicates even when no words are spoken. Taiwan Focus Analysis documents pressure on Taiwanese businesses and economic ties to generate fear about the costs of certain political outcomes. The intended message is simple: vote wrong and your market access or industry suffers. This can be calibrated to target regions or constituencies, intensifying domestic friction without a broad rupture. Money and local networks matter because influence isn't only in national media. It's neighborhood politics, brokers, associations, and trusted community nodes. Taiwan's investigators have flagged foreign money as an interference channel because funding can buy amplification, influencers, and local mobilizers that appear domestic. United Front-linked influence strategies aim to build leverage through intermediaries and social organizations rather than through overt propaganda. The risk is that influence can blur into intimidation at a local level, where small pressure can have outsized impact on participation. Timing is one of the most reliable weapons here, because the best narratives land when they are the hardest to verify and easiest to spread. Researchers track patterns of late-cycle scandal claims and document dumps designed to dominate attention when correction is slow. Doublethink Lab documented how seeded content can be rapidly amplified across platforms in ways that look organic until you map the network. Timing works because the connection rarely travels as far or as fast as the first emotional hit. Taiwan's defensive advantage is that it treats influencers as a persistent condition, not as occasional scandal. Democracy Support reporting highlights Taiwan civil society verification networks and rapid response habits as a model for adaptation. Public attribution flips the cost by turning covert manipulation into visible external intrusion, which can trigger backlash. Law and policy help by raising the risk of covert funding and infiltration, while the constant trade-off remains avoiding overreaction that fuels cynicism. The clearest thing to watch is not a single viral post, but ramp-up signatures. Narrative clusters that appear across unrelated accounts with similar phrasing and structure. Late-cycle scandal drops that demand instant emotional reaction and outrun verification, as well as economic signaling paired with messaging, because coercion works best when the pain story and blame story arrive together. Beijing doesn't need to win Taiwan's elections to win something very valuable. It wins if Taiwan becomes harder to govern, because division slows reforms and complicates crisis response. It wins if cynicism spreads, because cynicism makes resilience feel pointless and compromise feel tempting. The contest is ultimately about trust, because a democracy that trusts its own process is far harder to coerce than a democracy that doubts itself. While the information domain is certainly complex and a big target for China, its infrastructure is absolutely going to be priority number one. Taiwan has an Achilles heel that, if China can exploit it, could devastate the island without a single missile launch. A handful of undersea fiber cable routes carry the data that makes banking work, lets companies run cloud systems, and keeps Taiwan connected to partners. The scary part is how easy it is to disrupt a cable compared to how hard it is to prove intent, and how slow repairs can be when weather, ships, and security all become constraints. Once you see how cable cuts fit into blockade-style coercion, you can spot how early warning signs of soft isolation before shooting starts. Taiwan's most fragile infrastructure in a cross-strait crisis is connectivity, because modern states run on data leaving the island every second. Undersea fiber carries the overwhelming share of global internet data traffic, and Taiwan's links are the arteries that connect its economy to the outside world. If those links degrade, the first effects look mundane. Then they spread into finance, logistics, media, and public trust. Connectivity becomes a strategic variable because it shapes how fast Taiwan can coordinate internally and how convincingly it can show the outside world what is happening. The vulnerability is not that Taiwan lacks cables, it's that the system is finite, mappable, and dependent on specialized repair capacity. Taiwan hosts multiple international cable systems and multiple landing sites, but physical entry points and seabed corridors are still limited and predictable. Finite systems create choke points, cable corridors near coasts, landing stations, and the small global pool of specialized repair ships. Redundancy exists, but redundancy is not the same as resilience under repeated disruption, especially if incidents happen faster than repairs. To understand why cables matter, start with what they carry in practice, because cable failure is not an internet problem, it's a society problem. Financial systems rely on low latency, high capability links for payments, settlement, fraud detection, and interbank operation. Cloud services rely on constant cross-border connectivity for enterprise systems, data replication, software tools, and supply chain visibility. Media, messaging, and emergency services rely on stable bandwidth, and in a crisis, stable bandwidth often determines whether the public believes guidance or believes rumors. Connectivity is also a national security issue because modern defense and crisis management rely on continuous data movement. Military command and control, intelligence sharing, logistics coordination, and partner interoperability all depend on networks staying reliable under stress. If connectivity is degraded, decision cycles slow, situational awareness narrows, and coordination friction rises at the worst possible moment. In coercion scenarios, forcing friction onto Taiwan's decision-making loop can be strategically valuable even if no territory changes hands. Taiwan has built a significant cable network, but the stress test is whether it can keep the network functioning through repeated gray zone pressure. Taiwan Focus Analysis notes Taipei operates 14 international undersea cables, plus additional systems connecting the main island to offshore archipelagos. Offshore island links are especially sensitive because they often depend on only a small number of cables, so a couple breaks can mean weeks of degraded service. In a coercion campaign, offshore disruptions can become a live fire rehearsal for what partial isolation feels like, with lower escalation risk than striking the island. PMESII in 2023 shows how fast a cable incident turns into a political event. AP reported that PMESII's roughly 14,000 residents relied on two submarine cables, and both were cut within days in February 2023. Taiwan's National Communications Commission cited telecom reporting that suspected a Chinese fishing vessel and a Chinese cargo ship were involved. Analysis afterwards described how degraded bandwidth reshaped daily life, because when connectivity collapses, even basic tasks become unreliable and slow. The deeper lesson for PMESII is that small breaks can generate outsized strategic effects. Residents feel isolation immediately, and isolation changes how people talk about risk, government competence, and crisis readiness. The state has to scramble to provide backup connectivity, and the scramble itself becomes a visible sign of vulnerability. An adversary learns what Taiwan prioritizes, how quickly it can reroute traffic, and how long repairs actually take in real conditions. Cables also cut more than most people assume, and most global cable faults are not sabotage. Anchors, fishing activity, seabed hazards, and equipment failure drive a lot of ordinary breaks. That noisy baseline is exactly what makes gray zone tactics effective, because deliberate damage can hide inside what looks like normal maritime friction. The fight becomes less about whether a cable can be cut, and more about whether a pattern can be created that helps Taiwan off balance without triggering a clean casus belli. Attribution is hard because intent is hard to prove on the seabed, even when behavior looks suspicious. A vessel can drop its anchor, drag it, and claim that an accident, weather, or mechanical issues, even if the pattern looks deliberate. Flags of convenience or opaque ownership can also further muddy investigations and slow accountability. That ambiguity is a feature because it forces Taiwan to choose between escalation and acceptance without perfect proof. The 2025 cases show Taiwan treating cable incidents as a security trend rather than isolated mishaps. Reuters reported Taiwan detained a China-linked Togo-flagged cargo ship February 2025 after a cable connecting Taiwan and Penghu was damaged. Reuters reported Taiwan charged a Chinese ship captain in April of 2025 for intentionally damaging undersea communications cables, described as the first prosecution of its kind. Reuters cited Taiwan's digital ministry reporting 5 sea cable malfunction cases in 2025 at that time, compared to 3 in 2024 and 3 in 2023, which is the kind of pattern shift that raises alarm. Repairs are slow because undersea cable repair is a specialized maritime operation with its own choke points. Repairs require a repair ship, specialized equipment, safe sea conditions, and coordination among the companies that own the operated cable. IASS noted that the Asia-Pacific repairs can take the longest time to commence, citing delays up to 30 days from notification in some cases. Taiwanese reporting on a January 2025 damage case described repair timing as depending on weather and sea conditions, extending weeks out. Repairs also create a second vulnerability window because repair activity is visible and predictable. Repair ships have to loiter in a specific area for days, which makes them easy to monitor and potentially harass during heightened tension. If a coercion campaign aims to keep Taiwan degraded, it can focus less on a dramatic one-time cut and more on repeated disruptions, time to keep repairs permanently behind. That's how partial isolation can be sustained without ever declaring a blockade. This is where cables fit naturally into a blockade playbook, because cable disruptions support coercion short of war. Blockade-style pressure aims to make Taiwan feel economically and psychologically squeezed while preserving escalation control. Cable disruption adds a non-kinetic layer that hits finance, communications, and public mood without striking military targets directly. The combination is stronger than any single tool because information disruption amplifies economic fear and makes coordination harder. Cables also pair well with cyber operations because both target continuity and confidence. If connectivity is degraded while cyber incidents spike, the public struggles to separate accident from attack, and uncertainty spreads faster than facts. Even limited outages can trigger rumor cascades and political blame games, which is exactly what coercion tries to produce. The strategic goal is to make Taiwan's democracy feel like a vulnerability rather than resilience engine. Cable disruption also interacts with maritime pressure in a way that's hard to counter without escalation. Increased Coast Guard or maritime militia presence near cable routes can be framed as normal activity while still creating risk and intimidation. If Taiwan responds aggressively, Beijing can claim provocation, and if Taiwan responds cautiously, Beijing learns it can keep applying pressure. The effect is to force Taiwan into responses where every option has political cost. Resilience under this threat is less about one perfect fix and more about lowering the payoff of repeated disruption. More cables and more diverse landing sites matter because geographic diversity reduces the chance that one corridor produces national level degradation. Taiwan has discussed and funded resilience measures, including strengthening landing infrastructure and adding capacity, which fits a strategy of graceful degradation rather than perfect continuity. Backup connectivity helps, but satellites and microwave links are emergency bridges, not replacements for fiber at a national scale. Faster repair access is its own kind of deterrent as well, because if restoration time shrinks, coercion value begins to drop and the treadmill strategy becomes less attractive. The best way to spot deliberate pressure is to look for patterns, not single incidents. Repeated faults in the same corridor, especially paired with suspicious vessel loitering or anchor behavior, are more concerning than a one-off break. Clusters of accidents around politically sensitive moments suggest shaping behavior rather than a random chance. Vessel identity anomalies, including multiple digital identities and opaque ownership, can also signal deliberate deniability. Synchronized spikes in cyber incidents, disinformation narratives, and connectivity problems are also a classic sign of a coordinated coercion push. The big strategic point is that cutting cables is a cheap way to impose national level friction. The cost of disruption is low compared to the economic and political stress that it can create. The escalation risk can be managed through ambiguity, which is why these tactics show up in gray zone playbooks. In an island contingency, the most dangerous moves are often the ones that change daily life while looking deniable internationally. Taiwan's undersea cables aren't just a niche topic. They're part of a front line of coercion and crisis management. They connect Taiwan to global finance and communications in a way that no domestic substitute can fully replace. They've already been disrupted in politically sensitive contexts as well, from Matsu in 2023 to multiple incidents that Taiwan has reported in 2025. And they fit blockade-style pressure perfectly because they can partially isolate Taiwan, create uncertainty, and force hard choices without crossing the clean threshold into open war. If a quiet blockade ever begins, the cables are the first places that it will show. Thank you for watching this video and thank you for watching this series. This concludes the China and Taiwan kind of super series. Of course, China came before this series and now we're doing Taiwan. Next, we're going to be doing India and Pakistan. I've done videos on those before and they definitely proved to be a little controversial, so we're going to see what happens there. But like this video if you found it all helpful. Definitely share it with a friend if you think they would be interested in it. Comment what you think about this series and what you think about a China-Taiwan conflict, whether you think it's realistic here in the next few years. And comment what you want to see more of in future series. With all that, I'll see y'all next time. Later.